Hello, Greece and Rome students. Welcome back. I'm excited to finish Chapter 8 with you guys this week on Augustus. We're going to finish that today and tomorrow. I put it in my announcement, but I just wanted to remind you that at the end of this week, we're going to have our tests on Chapter 8 on Friday. So just kind of put that in your mind, be reviewing for that. We'll finish up the chapter probably today and Tuesday also, and then we'll do maybe a couple days of review or practice. I'll give you some study time, and then Friday will be our big test. So I'll give you more details about the test, but it'll be on campus, and obviously it'll be our first kind of online test. So I think it'll be pretty easy to navigate, but I'll give you more details about that later, okay? Make sure to pop into my office hours this week if you want to talk about anything about the test or anything about Chapter 8 that you're not quite sure about before then, okay? So I do want to go through a couple things with you today. Yesterday we finished off talking about Augustus's family and marriage legislation, how he had a big emphasis on getting people to get married earlier, have more children, have children earlier. He thought it was kind of Rome was approaching a demographic crisis, and it was important to him to get that fixed. So we're into Augustus's reign now. So I want to talk more about, the reign of Augustus itself. Now that he's firmly in power, he's completely in control at this point. In the second settlement we talked about the other day. So we know that Augustus had one child, Julia, with his wife Scribonia. After that, he never had another child, even though he got married to another woman, which I'll tell you about today. He never had another child. So one big thing on his mind was what happens when he dies. In the ancient world, you could die at any time. He wasn't quite sure. So that's what we're going to talk about now. Who would be his successor since he doesn't have a son? So he seems like from an early on during his emperorship, he's thinking of passing his power on, the power he has, of the princeps, the chief officer of the state, to someone from his family, someone close to him, right? Now, this is a very un-Republican goal because in the Republic, the idea is that people are elected. And, there's some unfairness with it with patricians and things, but the idea is that it's possible for you to rise up from nothingness, right? It's not passed down from father to son. It's not a hereditary monarchy or something like that. But clearly Augustus, and it's human nature, wants to keep this kind of within the family, pass it on to someone he thinks can continue his goals and continue it in his family. He didn't have the son, so we got to think about what else could he do. Now, it helps Augustus with this aim. At certain times in Roman history, maybe the Romans would be more resistant to him passing power on to someone, but the last 50 years or more had been a lot of civil war, tons of civil war, and there was just an appetite in Rome at this time for a peaceful succession from one emperor to another. And they're not called emperors, I'm calling them that, but from one leader to another, no one wanted civil war. They were just sick of it, and they wanted to take a breath and go a few decades without the Romans fighting a bloody civil war. So just the fact that people were just ready for a ruler like that kind of helped Augustus at that time period. So like I mentioned, he had only one child, Julia. He never had that son. He married his more long-term wife. Remember, Scribonia was only about a year before they got divorced, but he married his long-term wife, Livia Drusilla. We'll just call her Livia. That was his third wife. Scribonia was actually his second wife. We never even mentioned his first wife, but Scribonia was his second wife. He married Livia in 38, and he stayed with her until his death. So they were married for, I think about 50 years. So that was a very successful marriage. Now, sorry, I'm just pausing to think about the next area I want to tell you with. So he never had a child with Livia. She had her own children coming into the marriage, though. Livia, she already had children called Tiberius and Drusus, so there's obviously those to be Augustus' stepsons. There's a possibility they could factor into the succession somewhere. So keep Tiberius and Drusus in your mind. They were Augustus' stepsons, his sons by marriage. Now, his sister Octavia, who we know had been married to Mark Antony, she also had a son called Marcellus, and so that would make him Augustus' nephew. So that was another thing that Augustus thought maybe his nephew could be someone. So he wants to kind of groom Marcellus to possibly take over for him. Marcellus is a lot younger than him. He shows a lot of promise. And so Augustus has Marcellus married to Julia, his daughter. So the idea of that is, I'm going to bring him close into the family. Yeah, he's already my nephew, but now he's married to my daughter. Now you're probably thinking to yourself, isn't that her first cousin? Yeah, but this is, this is Rome. First cousins wasn't too close for them. So Marcellus was married. Now he's kind of Augustus's son by marriage and also his nephew. And Marcellus showed a lot of promise, and Augustus seemed to be grooming him to possibly be a successor. The problem, though, is Marcellus dies young. Even though he's much younger than Augustus, he gets some sort of mysterious illness, and we don't quite know exactly what it is even nowadays, and he dies far too young. So that goes out the window with Marcellus. So Augustus, in that same year, 23 BC, when Marcellus died, Augustus, he himself gets a very bad illness, and he nearly dies. He comes very close to death. He had a terrible fever. He was in bed for weeks, and he came really close to death's door. When he finally recovered from that, he seemed even more desperate to find a successor because he's thinking, if this happens to me again, I may not survive if I get sick again. So he kind of turns it up another notch. Another successor possibility is his friend Agrippa, who we've talked a lot about, who is his right-hand man. The only problem is Agrippa is just around the same age as Augustus, so he would rather give his power off to someone younger than him, who's maybe at least 10 or 20 years younger, so that someone who can rule long after. So even if Agrippa outlives Augustus, probably not by that long. So that's one thing, but it's still an option because you never know. If Augustus dies very early, maybe Agrippa could outlive him by 10 or 20 years. Who knows? So Agrippa, after Marcellus dies, Julia needs to get remarried. So Agrippa maneuvers, and he gets Augustus to agree for him to marry Julia. So Agrippa marries Julia, and it's a little bit of a weird marriage, especially in the modern day, because, like I said, Agrippa was the same age as Augustus, just about, and so it'd be like a girl nowadays marrying her dad's friend or something. It'd be kind of weird, but this is a political marriage more than anything else. So now Agrippa, who is not really from a good, I shouldn't say good, but like a high noble birth, now he's actually married into the imperial family, and this makes him more of a player in the possible succession talks. So he's actually kind of related to Augustus now. Okay, sorry, let me get myself out of here. So Agrippa and Julia are now married, and they produce a number of children. They have two sons. They end up having another son, but initially they have two sons, Gaius and Lucius, and Gaius is the older one. Augustus eventually adopts them both. It seems kind of weird at first to adopt your grandchildren, but again, these are political signs of people that I intend for these young boys to be a special part of my family and possibly a successor. So the fact that he adopted them was a sign that he was grooming them, probably. Now, Agrippa, though, ends up dying also much earlier than Augustus. He dies in 12 BC. So then, of course, Agrippa is now out of the running. And before that, Agrippa and Julia had, I believe, 5 kids. They had 3 sons and 2 daughters. So they were somewhat prolific before Agrippa died. But now where does Augustus go? Because Marcellus is dead, Agrippa is dead. He's got Gaius and Lucius, but they're very young. They're not, when their father dies, they're only 5 and 8 years old, so they're not quite ready if Augustus dies soon. So now he looks to Tiberius, who is his stepson. It's the son of his wife, the older son of his wife Livia. So he looks to him, and he has Tiberius marry his daughter Julia. So if you're keeping track, Julia has now been married 3 times already, and she's not even that old yet. So she's been married to Marcellus, and then he died. She's married to Agrippa, and he died. Now she's married to Tiberius. Tiberius himself had been married to a woman called Vipsania, but he was forced to divorce her in order to kind of marry into the Julian family. So Tiberius is now Julia's 3rd husband. The marriage of Tiberius and Julia, her 3rd marriage, was, for the Romans, considered not successful. It did not produce any children. They didn't seem to get along great. It didn't seem to be a super happy marriage just from the descriptions we have about it in the ancient world. And like I said, to be a successful Roman marriage, especially in Augustus's eyes, it needed to produce children, which is somewhat ironic since he only had 1 child and he wasn't very prolific himself as far as children goes. But anyways, that was considered an unsuccessful marriage. So something happened between Tiberius and Julia, and their marriage seemed to go off the rails, and Tiberius became bitter. Maybe as Gaius and Lucius were getting older, Augustus was showing them more favor because they're his actual grandchildren, whereas Tiberius is just his son by marriage. And so Tiberius, for whatever reason, one of these reasons, grows more bitter as he is married to Julia and he gets a little bit older. And eventually he decides to kind of leave Rome himself. He's not technically exiled, but he decides that He doesn't want to be near Augustus. He leaves his wife. He's embittered by this, whatever this series of events was, and basically he withdraws himself to the island of Rhodes, which is over near Greece. We talked about it last year in our Greece chapter. So he basically lives on the island of Rhodes until about 6 BC when he finally comes back. But he was there for a number of years and kind of lived as a recluse, kind of keeping to himself, not involved in matters of state or imperial matters. So it's kind of he was a weird guy, Tiberius, in some ways. Now, Julia, very interestingly with her, she was left, of course, in Rome. She was left in Rome whenever, I should say, Tiberius went to Rhodes in 6 BC. He did not come back in 6 BC. I'm sorry if I misspoke there, but he is there for a number of years before he's called back. Now, Julia, his wife, who stays in Rome, they're obviously still married, but not a happy marriage. That's one of the reasons he left. Julia herself must have done something very, very bad, because we don't know all the details, but we know that Julia is eventually exiled by Augustus in 2 BC. And unfortunately, this would be a super big finding if we ever found out the exact reason. We don't know enough here, but there's gossip and rumors by ancient Roman historians that her exile had something to do with scandalous sexual misconduct, right? What exactly is that? Something that Augustus felt so strongly about it that he would send his only daughter, his only child, away to Rome, away from Rome, never to come back. She's sent to an island, a small island called Pendatoria, where she has to live out her life. So shocking turn of events, really, that his only daughter gets exiled in this way. And again, we just know broadly it was something sexual misconduct, but we don't know exactly what that is. But it must have been bad in Augustus's eyes. We know he was big on promoting the family, so he must have taken a dim view of that. So disaster strikes. Lucius, if you remember, Gaius and Lucius were his two grandsons. Lucius dies in 2 AD as a young man, and Gaius dies in 4. So they both die very young. If you're keeping track of all this, Augustus, even though he leads a good life, obviously, as the emperor, he's got a lot of tragedy going on around him. His daughter is exiled. His Marcellus, his nephew, dies. His friend Agrippa dies. His two grandsons, Gaius and Lucius, are now dead. Some people in ancient Rome even thought there was a little too much of this to be coincidence. Maybe people around him were maneuvering or killing people so that they would become the heirs. We don't know that for sure. Those are just rumors and stuff. But certainly a lot of people around him unexpectedly died much younger than they should have, like Gaius and Lucius and Marcellus. So Augustus seems to get, his life changes at this point. He gets a little more kind of withdrawn, a little, it's shaking him, all these people dying around him, especially his young family members who he thought would one day possibly be a successor, his two grandchildren dying. So it's a huge blow to him mentally and just as far as governing. So Tiberius now was the only really option left. He was Augustus's stepson, and Augustus has no other close family members. So at this point, he's forced to reconcile with Tiberius, and he calls Tiberius back to Rome, and he adopts him. So now he's officially his adopted son, and he gives him the power of a consul. So Augustus, he's kind of forced into kind of signaling that Tiberius would be his successor. And Augustus eventually dies himself in AD 14. So he outlived all these younger members of his family and everything. Upon Augustus's death, which was a momentous occasion, if you're keeping track, that means he was emperor for usually we consider him being emperor around 27 BC. There's no exact date for sure, but usually that's the date. So that's, over 40 years of a reign, which is one of the longest reigns of any emperor. Usually there's things that are making him much shorter, like getting, assassinated or sick or various things. Okay. A couple of things happening during the reign of Augustus. These are kind of things about, the government and society at the time. During Augustus's reign, he reviews the Senate rolls twice, and basically he wants to make sure people are there who he thinks should be there, people there that are maybe supportive of him or up to his moral qualifications. So he decides that maybe the Senate had gotten too big. Remember, we had several people expand it, Sulla, then Caesar, and over time it had just grown as more people want to get in on the largesse of the government. So Augustus reduces the number to 800 and later on to 600 in 18 BC. So kind of pruning the Senate down, making it more of a manageable figure. That's a very large Senate. If you think about even modern governments nowadays, you should not have a Senate near that big. Augustus was a member of the Senate. He was kind of thought of as the, not just the dictator, but like the first member of the Senate, the leader of the Senate. His role was princeps senatus, the first of the Senate. He also established wealth qualification. There had always been unwritten qualifications to be in the Senate, of course, not just anyone could jump into it, but he made a minimum wealth qualification of 1,000,000 sesterces, which mean you had to be pretty substantially wealthy and endowed to be a member of the Senate. Elections at the time kept going. Remember, Augustus wants it to seem like the Republic is still churning along, even though it's not exactly that. Elections are relatively free during the time of Augustus, but if something happened where he really didn't like a candidate for something, or he really wanted something to happen, we know that he could exert influence when he wanted to, but probably he let the elections go along as long as things were going that weren't too unfathomable to him. Now, as far as the military, Augustus would appoint most top military officials. That was a huge thing. That's especially important because, yeah, if there's some praetor that doesn't like you, I can deal with that. But if the generals aren't loyal to you, that's a huge problem for an emperor. So Augustus appointed most top military commanders and administrative positions within the military. Senior senators were brought in to supervise grain rations, which had become a huge political issue. We've talked about that many times before. The grain supply has to keep flowing, and so that would be kind of a big position to be in charge of the grain supply. And other senior senators would be brought in to administer different things in the city, like the upkeep of buildings, aqueducts, roads, and these are things that just a major city like Rome, the biggest city of the ancient world, needed to keep running successfully and strongly. As far as Augustus is dealing with the Senate, keep an eye on this because obviously we're into what's called the empire now. You should kind of notice that. But also, if you didn't notice, we passed over into the AD time period for the entirety of this course. We've been in the years before Christ, but Jesus was actually born during the reign of Augustus. So from now on, after Augustus, at least our years will all be AD, Anno Domini, in the year of our Lord. So that's very interesting. And eventually we'll talk more about the Christian church and stuff. Some of these chapters get into the early church and Rome's involvement with the church, etc. So as far as Augustus's dealings with the Senate, he attended Senate and he would consult them respectfully. Remember, he learned from his uncle Julius Caesar that you don't just want to make the Senate feel completely marginalized or like they're nothing. So he would consult them respectfully. The Senate probably knew that even though he was going through the motions, that he had, power over them. So the Senate morale was low, because a lot of times they were voting on stuff, but it was decisions Augustus had already made, and everyone kind of knew the way they had to vote. It was kind of like a rubber stamp, as we would say nowadays. The equites did well under Augustus. These are the equestrians, the members of the kind of merchant class. As Augustus, he used them to manage properties, represent him in court, handle taxes, kind of some important things, tax payments and things like that. Some of these equites, Augustus called them procurators or procurates, which is kind of the agents is how we would translate that into English. And eventually his procurators were spread out through different provinces, and they would kind of be the kind of what we might call nowadays like a bureaucracy or something. That they were not the top political officials, but they were kind of the members of government who kept things running and reported to Augustus, etc. All the top officials in Egypt were exclusively equites. Now, we talked about why Egypt's so important. Huge grain supply there, huge fertile lands. So Augustus didn't want any chance. Why does it have to be an equites? Well, he's thinking if there's a patrician, someone who's noble, someone who might have more ambition, someone who wants to, who knows, overthrow Augustus or something, that could be an issue. So an equites maybe would have less ambition, more thankfulness to Augustus for their position, and so he never allowed a patrician to get the governorship or to run Egypt. So that's kind of an interesting part of that. Now, you should know about the Praetorian Guard. They're actually going to play a role with a lot of different emperors, so we're going to be talking about them. But they were basically the imperial guard, the personal bodyguard that surrounded Augustus and kind of kept order in the city of Rome, and kind of like almost like the Secret Service. Their Augustus's protection and later emperor's protection was in their hands, right? So Augustus over time transitioned that to also be run by equestrians, and the idea is that that's a powerful position. The leader, especially of the Praetorian Guard, which is called the Praetorian Prefect. That's a powerful position. So if that's run by someone more ambitious, some sort of leading patrician or something, they get all the soldiers loyal to them, and who knows what sort of crafty stuff they can get up to. So he trusted equestrians more than some of the patricians. Now some developments with the army. I love talking about military affairs and stuff. The army was big and had to be big to kind of Rome sprawled all over Europe and the Middle East and Africa now. So Augustus needed loyalty of his army. If it ever happened to where his army was not loyal to him, that could be a huge issue. If there was a province that went in rebellion or something, that could be a major threat to his rule, right? So he needed the loyalty of his army, and he also wanted to kind of update and bring the military into more of a modern professional situation. Gone were the days we talked about early in Rome's history where you bought your own stuff and you were a temporary soldier. He wanted to be more of a professional thing. So after the Battle of Actium, which is that big one with Mark Antony Cleopatra, where he kind of decisively won that war for the most part, he had about 140,000 men that were expected to be paid and had fought for him or had come to him after that battle. And early on, he leaned on Egypt because Egypt was a big source of wealth. Rome annexed Egypt, if you remember, after that war with Cleopatra, when Cleopatra and Mark Antony were out of the picture. So at first he leaned on that, but he had to spread that out over time. Some changes in the army during Augustus's reign to update things and professionalize things. The legionnaires eventually were all volunteers, so you're not at a certain time they would force people to be recruits, like this province or something had to give so many recruits. It became more of a volunteer service, which is similar to our military nowadays, where it's volunteer. And also you would serve a fixed number of years. So the idea is that it's not just, hey, we'll do this when needed, but it's like, no, you will serve for this amount of years, and then there's retirement at the end of the light at the end of the tunnel. So at first it was 15 years was your retirement, but later on during the reign of Augustus, this kind of became established as 20 years, which is very interesting because that's for most positions in the military, there's still 20 years as your standard retirement. So very interesting that time period is the same. What happened to you if you got to the end of that 20 years? Obviously, that was good. It means you hadn't died in battle or somewhere like that. After a year of service, you would get kind of a big retirement payment, a big discharge payment that was equal to roughly around 13 years of service. So that's pretty big. If you imagine if you retired from your job and you got over half of the money you had made as some sort of balloon payment at the end, that's pretty massive. But the idea was to keep soldiers going strong, working hard, and trying to do their best so that they would stay alive and make it to that end in sight. And then they get a big, nice payoff. They can retire. Sometimes that payoff even included land and a combination of land and money, depending on the time period. One detail about the soldiers was that they could not marry during their time of service. The idea was they had to stay mobile. They might be stationed in Syria, and then they're transferred to Gaul or something, and they're going to be on the move. Augustus didn't want them tied down, right? You're out after 20 years, you're still relatively young, you can get married after, but at this time period in Roman history, at least, soldiers were expected to kind of be free and to not be encumbered by a wife and children. So, at the end of Augustus's reign, some big changes to the military. The army was more of a career choice, not something you would do for a year or two, but you would do kind of more of a career for 15 or 20 years. And it was certainly more professional, being paid professional wages, supplies more professional. And it really had a huge area to govern, to watch out for. The legions had to be spread out from Europe and the areas they controlled in Europe, partially in Africa. In the East, a lot of legions were needed up in Gaul and Germany. So legions were needed all around. Yeah. So some interesting stuff today. So I'm going to stop there with you guys for today because we've gone through a lot of material already, but we are close to the end of the chapter. Tomorrow I will post the very last notes for the chapter, and you guys can finish up your notes. And then on Friday, we'll have our big test. So I'll put some practices and things like that on Wednesday or Thursday. You can also pop into my office hours, which are every day from 10 to 11 to chat with me about the chapter. Okay. If you need me to do anything, extra to help you get ready, make sure to let me know with a message or popping in my office hours. But hopefully the notes are working for you guys and you're able to get a lot of the good information. Make sure to be reading along because that helps a lot when you read these things in the chapter yourself. Hope you guys are doing very well, and I will see you tomorrow for the end of our chapter. Wale.